Separate X, Y, and Z position properties is a feature that advanced 3D users in After Effects have been clamoring for ages. After Effects is rather unusual in that it bundles together the X, Y, and Z values all into one keyframe and combines it with the time of those parameters. This is actually a pretty easy way to work and very easy to control in many applications. However, there are some animation moves that are just very difficult to handle when you can't get separate access to X, Y, and Z. One classic case is a bouncing ball animation. Here in After Effects, I've added a very simple layer. Let's say that during the course of this composition, I just wanted to bounce off the bottom and end up down here. This is kind of hard to set up. So for example, if I go down here in the middle and say down here, I want my shape to be down here. I'm going to hold G to break my handle. Bring it down here like that. Shape it up. Give myself another keyframe down here. Down in the middle, and again, hold down G to break my handles. And there we go. Well, that's the basic shape of the motion path I want, but the pacing's a bit crazy. For example, it's much too even and smooth. It's just not the right sort of motion that you'd get in a normal bounce animation. So it's going to take a lot of tweaking of the keyframe timing to get any sort of convincing animation out of this, even with the After Effects graph editor. Now you can keep holding handles and playing around with the timing of keyframes and trying to get it right, but it's going to be quite a challenge to make this convincing. What you need to do is analyze the animation. What's going on is you want to keep a constant speed from left to right in the X dimension, but you want to play around with starting, stopping, and reversing in the up and down or the Y dimension. If you could separate those parameters, it'd be much easier to control. So let's show how you do it in After Effects CS4. I'm going to open up a second composition. I've got my little object again. I'm going to go ahead and set my time back to the start and set a position keyframe, and I'm going to go straight into the graph editor this time. Now you see initially I have a single white line that contains my X and Y position. But if I go ahead and select position and click this new icon, separate dimensions, I now get separate X and Y parameters for the position of my little object. If I go to the end of my composition here, I can treat them separately. I can say, well, in X, I know I want my ball to travel across my screen. And now you see I've got a ramp as it moves at a steady pace across the screen. But then in Y is where we want to start having some fun. Let's go ahead and go back to roughly the time of the first bounce that I want, and go ahead and move it down to where I want it to be, right around there, right around the bottom. Then we'll go to the timing of our second keyframe, and say go ahead and add another keyframe there. Then go down to the end of my comp, right-click, and add a third keyframe. If I double-click position, I've got all these parameters selected, and I want to make them Bezier handles, so I can go ahead and change how things bounce. So I'll go ahead and right-click, keyframe interpolation, and change my interpolation type to Bezier. This will give me handles in the graph editor. And now I can start to play around with the velocity of these bounces. And by making a bounce shape in my graph editor, you'll see I'm getting a bounce shape out of my motion path in the comp panel. Let's go ahead and lower that so the bounce isn't as high. Go back here. Maybe a little less overshoot there, so it comes down like that. There we go. Now remember in After Effects, the spacings of the dots indicate how much travel is going on between frames. We have a lot of space between the dots right close to our bounce, and that's where it should be. It should be moving the fastest when it hits the ground. And you'll see the dots are very closely spaced at the very top of my travel here as I go through my bounces. And I'm going to go ahead and RAM preview this. And you'll see now I've got a really natural bounce motion. And that was pretty easy to set up. This would have taken a lot of time tugging around with keyframes and handles to get even close without this feature. Now the fun thing is I could go into 3D if I wanted. I could keyframe the Z separately as well, have it go off into space while it's bouncing without interrupting my X, Y, and Z. I'm going to turn that off. Now the other great thing about having separated is it's very easy to accommodate client changes. For example, say the client said, I like the bounce motion, but I don't want it to travel as far. Well, it's very simple. You can go to the end, to the second X keyframe, scrub it back so it doesn't travel as far, and you've left your Y keyframes completely unmolested. You've got your bounce. It's just happening in less space along the X dimension. Great way of working. Now there are pros and cons to this separate XYZ. One of the cons is that you no longer have Bezier handles on your motion path to tug it around. Everything's being done in the graph editor at this point, so that's a little bit of a mind change. One of the advantages of working this way, aside from what I've shown already, is you do have the ability to go ahead and rejoin your X, Y, and Z parameters to get back to the old style keyframes. Now, since the two worlds don't translate exactly, you won't get exactly the same motion back, but if you really need to go back to a case where all the keyframes are bundled together because you want to start playing around with editing motion paths, well, you can go ahead and do it. Now, for those of you who don't have CS4 yet or think it may be a while till you get to upgrade, there is a feature in CS3 that gives you some similar functionality. If you select the layer and apply the animation preset, separate XYZ position, what you get is a special expression controller with separate X, Y, and Z controls that in turn control the position parameters of the layer you've applied it to. So rather than animating the position of that layer, you animate these X, Y, and Z expression controls. It's another way of getting a similar result, although it's admittedly more cumbersome than the separate X, Y, Z in CS4. Like I mentioned up top, this is one of the features that people have been clamoring for ages, particularly advanced animators. It's going to make a lot of particular camera moves, like certain dolly and track moves, much easier to perform.